This is Words Aptly Spoken, which comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word. Well, welcome to Words Aptly Spoken, where Jennifer Courtney, Tim Knotts, and I discuss a book each week from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum. It is Wednesday, November 8th, 2023. I'm Lee Bortons. Today, we are also joined by CCMM curriculum developer, Brittany Lewis, and she's been with us all month. And Jennifer, why don't you tell us about this month's shows?
All right, so this month we're mostly discussing the ancient classics using the study guide by Peter Leithart called Heroes of the City of Man. So we have recorded an episode on Hesiod's Theogony, and today we're going to talk about Oedipus Rex, and then we'll tackle the Aeneid and the Odyssey. We will have a special episode about the Mayflower Compact in honor of Thanksgiving.
That'll be fun. Okay. Well, let's get going.
All right. So, well, you know what I'm going to ask you first, Lee. Why is Oedipus Rex in the Classical Conversations curriculum?
Yeah. Well, part of me wants to be funny and say, just to be confusing, a while ago, and Mom came up to me, she said, but Oedipus Rex is not one of the stories in the Leithart book. That's the study guide. And why is it in there? And so I was like, I'm pretty sure it is. Well, it turns out it has multiple titles. Oedipus Tyrannus and also Oedipus the King, and they are all the same play according to Google, and Jennifer confirmed that for me today. So I wanted to make that cleared up for those who are confused. It's in the curriculum, Oedipus Rex in particular, because it's part of the Leithart series from the Heroes of the City of Man, and it's a really famous story. It's got a lot of applications to time immortal, and there's even a lot of various movies that look at that kind of the same kind of story, which maybe we can talk about some of those later. Anyway, it's here because it's part of that Greek and Roman classics that we were reading in and challenge for, and we're giving our students a chance to actually dig back into Western roots and hear some of the myths and stories that have made it into Western culture.
Yeah, I love that. And it's interesting because sometimes we do get confusion from families who are looking into classical conversations about, or unfamiliarity, I'll say, with some of the books that we read. But most people still today do know the plot of Oedipus Rex. So as we get into it, I imagine some of the story will be familiar to all of our listeners. So Tim, Leah already alluded to the fact that we have Oedipus Tyrannus in the Leithart book, and then most people refer to it as Oedipus Rex. Who is Oedipus, and why does he have these two titles?
So Oedipus, it's a play by Sophocles, and in the story, Oedipus is the king of Thebes. He's at the beginning of the story really a much loved king. So Oedipus Rex would make good sense to us. Those of us who have a little bit of Latin background know that Rex is the word for king. So Oedipus the king is just the direct translation from that Latin name. But the Greeks originally called it just Oedipus before Sophocles wrote the second play that's called Oedipus, which is Oedipus at Colonus. And so then they started calling it Oedipus Rex, or in Greek, Oedipus Tyrannus, because it needed to be distinguished from the other Oedipus play. Tyrannus, of course, is the Greek word from which we get tyranny or tyrant from. And that's accurate here. In our modern era, we think of tyrants as people who haven't illegitimately either obtain or hold on to power at the top. And they're usually self-indulgent and an overbearing ruler of other people. Tyrants are. But for the Greeks, it really didn't matter what kind of a ruler you were. You were a tyrant if you were illegitimately holding on to that power, even if you were a benevolent ruler. So Oedipus, at the beginning of the story, they don't know that Oedipus is a tyrant. They think that he's rightfully the king. but through the course of the play, it is discovered that he is indeed a tyrant, whether he knew it or not.
So there you go. Our adding that to the title has meant that we have created a spoiler right there by calling it that. All right. Well, we've in previous episodes of Words Aptly Spoken, we've talked a lot about Freytag's pyramid, but it's been a while. So I'll just, since we don't have a whiteboard, I'll draw in the air that we start with an exposition in our story, which gives us the characters and setting. And then we, generally speaking, have some kind of rising action, which leads us to a climax, which resolves the character's problem. And then we typically have falling action and a denouement, which is just a French word that means unknotting the story. So that's where we hear how everyone's, well, in some stories, we hear how things are going to go for them out after the action of the book. Not always. we don't always get all the knots untied. So Brittany, why don't you start us off at that bottom of the pyramid by telling us about the characters and the setting of this one?
Sure. So as the main character, Oedipus, the king, or the tyrant, as Tim so explained so well, he is the king of Thebes, and so the setting is set in the city of Thebes, and it starts in the middle of things, and we start to learn that there's a priest of Zeus who's concerned. There's a plague going on, so he comes in, and the previous king had a wife. Her name is Jocasta, who is also Oedipus's wife, and we learn other things about his relationship to her as the play goes on. And did I mention Creon, Oedipus's brother-in-law and uncle is Creon. And then we have another blind prophet, Tiresias, and he's also somewhere called the king. And then there's various messengers, old shepherds. Oedipus and Jocasta have two young daughters, Antigone, you might be familiar with that play, and Ismene. And then there's a chorus of senators, which is a really important part of Greek tragedy and Greek plays. So the voice of Thebes.
Yeah, so my students and I were talking about that yesterday, that idea of the chorus. So I'm in Challenge 4 this year, so I'm reading these works, and they were thinking about the last time they saw a chorus, which was in Shakespeare's plays, where the chorus would come out and tell you to imagine yourself being transported to France in the days when they didn't quite have the stagecraft. But in this play, the chorus is kind of serving the function of the narrator, would you say? Is that fair, Brittany? Or
yeah, or a commentary. The citizens' voice, they're senators. So that was interesting. I forgot that until I looked again at the play.
Yeah. So I mentioned first, let me say this, because we decided, I think, by rule of committee that there are no plot spoilers if the book is over 100 years old. They're super sensitive, being ready to tell you what happens in this play, which I said most people still remember. So Tim and Brittany, Tim, why don't you start us out? So kind of what's the main action that everyone kind of knows about?
Yeah, I mean, there's the whole Oedipus complex that came out of this in the modern psychological movement. But Oedipus, it ends up discovers through the course of the play that he had been born prince and taken away to the countryside and given into the care of another couple. Earlier, because again, as Brittany said, we're starting in the middle of the action here in the story. He receives a prophecy that he's going to kill his father, and so he runs away from home, not knowing that his adoptive parents are only adoptive parents, and so he runs off to Thebes, where on the way into town he meets an old man with whom he gets into an altercation and kills him. It ends up that the old man was his father, the king of Thebes. I don't know how he doesn't recognize a king when he sees him, but apparently this is part of the tragedy of the story. But he arrives in town and ends up wooing the king's wife, who is, of course, his mother, and he marries her. And so where the story begins in the play, as Brittany's pointed out, there's a plague going on. And this is pretty common in Greek tragedies, right? The gods are sort of putting their thumbs on the scale and causing hidden things or mysteries to be revealed. And so this plague causes Oedipus to send Creon off to consult the oracle. Creon comes back and explains that it's a plague because the murder of the former king has gone unsolved. And so Oedipus goes about trying to figure out, as a good king would, figure out how to end this terrible plague that's afflicting his people. And through the office of the prophet Tiresias, he discovers that he is the one who has killed the former king. So we have this sort of very, I mean, the denouement is the unnodding. We have a very naughty situation going on in this story.
In many ways.
Yep,
In many ways, yeah.
Naughty and naughty. And so then Oedipus in grief puts out his own eyes and is put into the care of his daughters. So it's pretty terrible story.
Yeah, and so a lot of people are familiar with it, not so much necessarily because of the play, but because of the Oedipal complex, as explained by Sigmund Freud in the 20th century, that idea of being in love with one's mother, perhaps beyond the natural age where that's appropriate. So, so this is a pretty typical, I think, of Greek plot where there is someone tries to escape their fate and they cannot. So we'll talk more about that aspect in a minute, because despite everyone's attempts not to fulfill this prophecy of him killing his dad and marrying his mother, he ends up doing just that. And there's echoes in there, which we've talked before too about echoes. We have lots of stories where there are prophecies about a coming king, and then people try to do away with that baby. So can you guys think of a few of those? I was trying to think of examples.
Besides the ones in scripture that are the obvious ones.
Let's start there.
Yeah, I mean, Herod, while they're in Bethlehem, and even his son saying that they're going to kill the babies as Joseph and Mary are headed back to from Egypt towards the Bethlehem area. And they have to hide for a little bit longer, and they go into Nazareth. So we've got those two. And then I think about, it's not the same story, but just this whole idea that when there was invasions in the Old Testament from the various kings into the tribes of Israel, killing the babies was really an important thing to do, because if you don't want your enemies to rise up again, that's an easy slaughter. And we could also then make the modern day translation to the very political situation we're in right now, where abortion is legal and we're fighting over should it be legal at each of the state levels. And so it is a timeless story in that sense.
Yeah, the prince in exile story is a pretty famous one, right? That's a popular trope. In other Greek myth, Paris is sent away by Priam, king of Troy, because of some prophecies, and ends up dooming Troy by returning with Helen on his arm a little later.
Yeah. I was thinking also fairy tales like Sleeping Beauty, where a princess is hidden away to try to avoid a terrible fate.
Yeah, and Snow White.
Snow White.
Yeah, same thing. And so often the person who is in charge of disposing of the baby instead tries to hide them away, and then they come back. That's part of the trope. Right? Yes. They can't kill them, and so they come back.
Well, Moses, right? That's an obvious one.
Yeah. Moses, I forgot.
Yeah.
Of course.
Well, So as we move our way up the plot, we do have this idea, or up the pyramid, we have this idea of stories having different kinds of conflict. And so we've talked before about a few of the common ones: man versus man, man versus nature, man versus society, man versus himself. And then of course, when we get to the Greeks, we often have man versus the gods, little g. So Brittany, I'll punt this question to you. It's a hard one. What kind of conflict do you think Oedipus Rex is?
I wonder if it could be a couple, because he initially is the man versus man. So you could say when he fights the king and kills him. And then there's man versus himself. He does not know who he is. He thinks he does, but he really does not. And he ends up doing the one thing he's trying to avoid. Because I think he's, in many ways, portrayed as a good man or a wise man. I've always read it that way. I could be wrong about that. And then man versus God, because the gods, little g, because he tries desperately to escape the oracles about himself, and he thinks he's free and clear, and just walks right into the horrific sin that he's trying to avoid, with terrible consequences he can't control.
Yeah, it's pretty ironic that he really is a pretty pious man, right? He
Right.
seeks to do right by his people and right by the gods. I think the only real crack in that facade is when he receives word that his adoptive father has died. When he's king now, right? He's left his adoptive parents' home. He hears that his adoptive father has died, and he actually celebrates, because now he says, well, look, I'm finally free and clear of this terrible prophecy, because my dad's dead. I can't kill him. So I don't know, maybe there is a little bit of a crack in that piety in some sense there, but still, he's, like Brittany said, he's portrayed as a pretty good man. So it's hard to see him as sort of a villain in the story.
Yeah, he's more of the tragic victim. Yeah. Sorry, Lee, were you saying
Oh,
that?
no, I would say the victim. But the thing is, isn't that all of our stories, whether you appreciate the Freudian side of things, that if it should be a scary thing if we don't know our real father.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's good. Oh, yeah. Well, I won't digress just yet. Maybe it'll come back around. So Oedipus Rex is one of the dramas that we read in CC. Most, not quite all, but most of the other ones we read are works by Shakespeare. And so I wanted to take a minute for us to think about how this ancient Greek play compares to, something from a Christian Western playwright. So what do you guys think about the comparisons between Oedipus Rex and Shakespeare? And I left it wide open. You can compare it to any Shakespeare play you want.
Yeah, I wonder why he didn't take on this play. Maybe he didn't have access to it. I don't know. It reminds me of Macbeth and Hamlet.
Yeah.
Both tragic things where a son of a king is wrestling with some hard things. Well, is Macbeth the son of a king? He's a Thane, I think, right?
Well, his is, yeah,
he's not quite yet.
Son, but it is definitely the same thought with I thought about that too, Brittany, because of the prophecy and the role that prophecies of becoming the king play in that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what made you, so you were just thinking about succession? I interrupted your train of thought, Brittany.
Yeah, I was thinking about succession and what to do. Macbeth makes the choice to kill the king so he can take his place. Oedipus tries to avoid doing, he doesn't know he's killing a king. The king had insulted him and he defended himself on the road. It sounds terrible the way it's described. And we didn't mention the Sphinx part of the riddle solving, where he delivers Thebes the first time and is made the king. Because of this tragic thing, it seems like he can't avoid the plague, and Macbeth can't avoid the consequences of his choices. It seems like he thinks he just has to do this one thing, and he's the master of his fate. Oedipus makes quite a few choices trying to avoid his fate.
Yeah.
I was thinking about how Hamlet, it's almost the reverse in one way, because
Mm.
Hamlet knows who his mother is, and he's almost obsessed with her marriage in a way that gets him into trouble.
So, I mean, the Shakespeare and other playwrights build on or construct their plots in imitation of the ancient Greek comedies and tragedies. This is almost an archetype of a tragedy plot, right? I mean, Oedipus is born into privilege, raised in sort of the countryside in poverty, rises to become king of Thebes, a powerful city state, is loved by his people, and doesn't do anything terribly wrong of his own, but fate brings him down, right? It's this tragic story that isn't even his own fault in it, right? He's done everything right in a sense, and yet falls into a terrible set of events that he couldn't avoid. And I think that's part of, again, what the Greeks are particularly good at, and maybe Shakespeare's stories tend to be a little messier because they tend to be a lot of some right and some wrong, more real world than the Greek stories that tend to be sort of starkly good or starkly bad people.
Right. And it's complicated by the fact that Shakespeare's characters, because Christianity is the predominant worldview, they have free will and choice in a way that Oedipus doesn't. And so their tragedy is always in their choices. Oedipus's tragedy is just being born into that fate, I guess, where they have, that's part of the messiness, is that they have a lot of opportunities to control their fate by making different choices than the ones that, so.
I got a question going back to the man versus or the conflicts. Why are they always verses? Is it possible, Jennifer, for us to write a good story that's man with nature, using it appropriately, or man with God, honoring him as we should, or man with other men, being in communion appropriately? Why is it we always talk about the negative?
I think there's a couple reasons. One is that in some ways that duality tends to be a Western mindset, this versus that. It's harder for us to think in both ends sometimes. And the other is that you have to, what I don't think you can write is a good story that has only harmony in it. There has to be a problem to be solved, a situation to be healed, that kind of thing. So there has to be some verses. So you could have a story of man versus nature where it ends up with man and nature in harmony. But if it's that way from the beginning, you don't really have a story because there's no problem for the hero to solve.
So is it then a comedy rather than a tragedy if it ends up being a with at the end instead of a versus still?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And what's interesting about Shakespearean tragedies that I think is slightly different from the Greek ones too, is that he always puts in the seed of things being healed and restored. So at the end of Hamlet, there is a plan for succession and there is hope for the continuation of the story in a way that you don't always see in the Greek stories. Shakespeare's tragedies always include that seed. And sometimes the comedies include this seed that it's going to come apart again. So that's another way in which Shakespeare is more messy. He's just very conscious about those cycles of life that we go through and how we're harmed and healed by our choices.
So how could we position some of these shorter books like Oedipus or Theogony? Maybe Theogony is not a good example, but to talk to our students about fatalism or stoicism and the things that aren't Christian that are in those books.
This is the tangent I was going to go on a minute ago and didn't. Is that yesterday in Challenge 4, my students and I were discussing the wisdom literature in Job and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And so I think the story of Job is a good contrast to Oedipus Rex. Job also has not chosen anything. He's not chosen to do anything, and yet he also has great tragedy befall him. The difference in that conflict, you could probably say that's a conflict of man versus God, capital G, potentially. But the difference is that the God in there is not flippantly spinning the wheel of fate. God is wise and immutable and loving and has a plan, unlike the Greek gods. So I think that would be a great contrast for our students to think about.
Because I was thinking it's not even Job versus God. God's always on Job's side.
Right.
It's more Job versus little g God, Satan.
Right. Yeah.
And Job versus self, right? Is he going to
Mm-hmm.
be consistent to who he knows he is, or is he going to act according to his immediate circumstances? And again, I think another thing that is a great contrast is here, Oedipus is fated by the gods who don't care about Oedipus. They're not working for his good. They're just doing what they want to do. But our God works for our good all the time. So even when we encounter trials of various kinds, we can trust in him because his works are good and good for us.
Right. And so that allows what you said allows the book of Job to move forward. It allows Job and his friends to try to explore the question of who God is and be answered in just the way that you describe, with a better understanding of God's wisdom. Whereas Oedipus doesn't have that recourse. There's no answer to why this fate has been handed down to him. Job gets an answer in many ways.
Yeah, the answer. So it strikes me as the difference again between Christians who live in a world with windows. We can see outside of it because we know there's more, versus the secularists who was not even interested in knowing if there's more than themselves, and how a lot of Job's friends' questions were materialist questions. They were the questions of someone that lives only in the three-dimensional world we're in, if you want to bring math into the equation. Yet if you knew that just like your pinky's a small part of your body, that your flesh here on the earth is a small part of your eternal soul, you wouldn't mind losing it so much. Just like I'd rather lose my pinky than my whole body, right, from an illness or a problem. I'd rather, and the scriptures say it's better to lose your body than your soul. But our materialism, our stoicism, our fatalism, whether we mean for it or not, as Christians even, forms our senses of what's going on when tragedy occurs or illness occurs. It's really, really hard to see the unseen. This is why we talk about these dark books. There's not many of them in CC's curriculum. There's only a few towards in the Challenge 4 when the kids are older. I mean, there's a couple of dark scenes, like in To Kill a Mockingbird or in Passage to India, but they don't overwhelm the book like a couple of these stories do. And it's so that we have a contrast too, because comparison is one of the 5 common topics. And they're older. They're 17, 18 years old at this point, and they're thinking about, am I going to be a father soon? Am I going to go get a career? Am I going to be, a missionary? And it's a good opportunity to talk about these things. So I want to thank our sponsor, classicalconversationsbooks.com, where the books we're discussing can be purchased. We have the entire 2023 Words Aptly Spoken calendar at leebortons.com with links to the CC Books site. And pretty soon we're going to be updating with next year's schedule. I can't believe this year's gone by so fast. Thank you so much, you guys, for being on this with me. Next week, we're going to continue our exploration of the ancients by discussing the Aeneid by Virgil. Jennifer, let's dig into the book.
Okay, so this, we're going to start by reading a little bit out of Leithart's book, Heroes of the City of Man, to give us some background to the play. So we're going to, we started in the middle in our discussion. We're going to back up now. And this is a little bit of a continuation of what we talked about with Hesiod, just thinking about what was the purpose of literature for the Greeks. So Lee, you want to read this first one? It's from page 280.
Sure. Move it up so I can see the camera. Political circumstances in Athens are important background to tragedy. Paul Cartledge, another author, points out that most of our surviving tragedies were composed during the Peloponnesian War that pitted Athens against Sparta, and the plays reflect the social strains that the war produced. More generally, the plays discussed are preoccupied with dilemmas and dangers that face the polis, the city-state. That was the characteristic political form of the classical period of Greek history. I almost feel like I need to read that again quietly. There's a lot of nouns in there.
Mhm.
So the Peloponnesian War, Tim, you want to tell us what that was to remind our listeners?
Sure.
Anything?
So the Peloponnesus is that part of Greece that includes both Sparta and Athens. And the Peloponnesian War was actually several of them. The Peloponnesian Wars went on between the two great city-states that occupied that part of the civilized world at that time. They're two really different places. Sparta had a very militaristic and hierarchical society, and Athens was the home of democracy and far more sort of intellectual, philosophical in its nature. Democracy made Athens both robust in its ideas, but also very fragmentary in its people. And so when the Peloponnesian Wars were going on, they would sort of coalesce around a leader for a while. But when things went well, that was great. But when they didn't go so well, society would sort of fall apart, and they went through a variety of different forms of government through those years. Many of which were terribly tragic for them, and not in this sort of Greek tragedy sense, but didn't go well. It was a bad time in Athens, and again, Leithart mentions that there's all these societal pressures that were going on because there were competing ideas about what should be done and who should be in charge and how should they handle these things, and whether they should give in and just let Sparta rule, or whether they should fight back, or whether they should have a mighty army or not. And it was a very fraught time for Athens.
Okay, so biblically, wasn't that during some of the time of Esther? I'm trying to place it for folks that aren't familiar with the Peloponnesian Wars. I think that's right, that one of the kings that the Spartans fought against was Ahasuerus, her the man she married. But
I think you're thinking about the Persian Wars, perhaps.
they're later, right?
Yeah, so the Peloponnesian Wars were
Okay.
about 400 years before Christ.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're looking at the beginning of the quiet period between the Old Testament and New Testament.
Mhm.
Oh, well, I tried.
Well, I was thinking about when you said nouns in there. So we've got the Peloponnesian War, and then we've also got the polis, which is a really important noun for the idea of the Greek city-state, where we get our idea of politics. And, everyone was thinking about and writing about politics in Athens particularly. And so yesterday, my students and I had a discussion about the Iliad and the warring states and the rhetoric that was involved in convincing each other to come together for Greece to fight Troy. And now we're moving into the Odyssey, which is not have the whole polis in mind, but more of a household with Odysseus's household. So those two things kind of give us all the plays. And in fact, here in Oedipus, they intersect. We have what happens in this household is in fact also what happens in the whole kingdom. So thoughts about that quote, Brittany?
Yeah, I was just thinking about how the Greeks are so good at giving us really human questions to ask, because we know as Christians that we struggle with pride and raising ourselves up, the desire to be on top or whatever that we're tempted to do. And here we have a man who's leading a kingdom who does not know who he is, and his choices plunge the kingdom into a horrible plague. And so I was just thinking about what we could learn from this play about how to make peaceful decisions together as citizens of a state, what the answer is.
I'm glad you mentioned that too, because I think one of the truths that my Chums 3 and 4 students have come to over and over the years, one of the things that broadens their perspective in those years is their recognition that their sins are not private, that their sins affect their family and their church community and their CC community and their neighborhood. And so they get to see that here in these plays, just as you described. So.
It leaves you with an ache because you know that they don't have the answer that we have.
Yeah, it does. That's a good
Which
way.
is good. I mean, I think that's a good thing for our students and for us to taste what that feels like to have that kind of worldview. So we might have compassion, empathy.
Yeah.
And remember to share the hope we have in Christ.
Yeah. That's good. Well, you kind of led right into the quote you were going to read, Brittany. Do you want to read about the play?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I will. Thank you. And justly, you will see in me an ally, a champion of my country and the God. For when I drive pollution from the land, I will not serve a distant friend's advantage, but act in my own interest. Whoever he was that killed the king may readily wish to dispatch me with his murderous hand. So helping the dead king, I help myself. Ironic.
So tell us why you said that, Brittany. I think that's the right response.
Well, I think it probably would have been even more ironic for the audience, the original Greek audience, because they knew the story and things begin in the middle, and he keeps saying these things and he thinks he knows and understands perfectly who he is and what's going on and what his good choices have done, and he's completely blind to his own self-interest leading him down a path that he most tried to avoid.
Yeah. So this is sort of the textbook of dramatic irony, isn't it? Where the audience is sitting there going, oh no, if you try to kill the king's killer, you are not serving your own interest. Also that unless you commit suicide, the king's killer is not going to want to murder you. And so the audience gets to sit back and have all of these realizations that Oedipus himself can't have yet. Did you have a thought, Tim?
Yeah, there's this theme of blindness that goes through the play. Tiresias is a blind prophet. He actually calls Oedipus blind at one point before he ever puts out his eyes, because he can't see what he should be seeing, and I think that little speech is very much one of those moments where it's like, oh, if only you could see, you would not say such things as this. But also, I mean, that part reminds me a lot of when Nathan comes to David and tells him the little parable of the neighbor who steals the little sheep from his neighbor, and David gets very angry at this man, this unrighteous man, and then Nathan reveals, oh, it's you. And and in both cases, I mean, I think there is sort of this repentance that happens in Oedipus, or this but unlike with David, where David goes to the Lord and repents and is restored, Oedipus, it despairs because there's no coming back in his system, right? In his philosophy, in his religion, there's no restoration from what he's done. And so it's just despair.
It also reminds me of Peter and his sin of omission and saying 3 times he didn't know Jesus. And then when he realized what he had done, he went from being blind to seeing. And I mean, if there was ever someone that needed compassion, it's Peter. Because an amazing grace. I once was blind, but now I see. And it's all through our love of the Lord and our recognition of who we are and without him and who we are with him.
Yeah, and that's again, we talked a little bit last week about the challenge 4 theme of leadership. Part of being a good leader is seeing rightly, seeing yourself rightly, seeing others rightly, seeing situations rightly. And that's what we're trying to help our students do and sharpen as we read this literature. You know, we assume they're never going to be faced with this exact situation. But this allows them to perceive themselves better.
Yeah, it's the sort of the ironic that right, Tiresias, the blind seer, is the one who sees rightly the situation, and all those around him who can see can't see
Yes.
the situation rightly. And that's, I mean, Homer was blind. There's this recurrent theme of people who have lost the ability to see having that enhanced sight of understanding instead of seeing with their eyes. And again, that helps. I think that helps us with good conversations about the fact that we're called to walk according to faith and not by sight.
It makes me also think about Milton and his sonnet on his own blindness, and what is God doing with that, and what is he going to call him? What service does he now do now that he's physically blind? And of course, we can see several hundred years later, we can see what God wanted Milton to do quite clearly, but he himself was struggling with that physical blindness, and he, I think, also learned to see spiritually. So,
well, I'm thinking of Fanny Price and all our hymns. I mean, everything he does for us, when this seems good or bad, is always a gift. He always has our best interest. So are we going to spend time on the next one, Jennifer?
Yeah. So, Tim, you and Brittany both led into your own quotes. So you talked about the blindness. Now we're going to look at Oedipus putting out his eyes. So
Give me the gory part, thanks.
I did.
All right. He says, I do not know with what eyes I could look upon my father when I die and go under the earth, nor yet my wretched mother, those two to whom I have done things deserving worse punishment than hanging. Would the sight of children, bred as mine are, gladden me? No, not these eyes, never. And my city, its towers and sacred places of the gods, of these I robbed my miserable self when I commanded all to drive him out. The criminal since proved by God impure, and of the race of Laius.
So sad. It makes me think my favorite line from the play is when he's arguing with Tiresias, the blind prophet who sees even though he cannot physically see, and he tells Oedipus, I am free, for I have in me the strength of truth. And when we read that as Christians, we can say of all people that have walked the earth, we can say that because of what God has done for us. We have the truth himself in us. We are then free. But poor Oedipus doesn't. He can't see his way out or have any kind of hope of redemption. In fact, he punishes himself.
And yet Thebes will go on beyond him. He's not quite thinking rightly. His own children do go on, and his city goes on, and his legacy is not as dire as he thinks. Some of the children manage to be quite virtuous. So there's that hope.
Good. Well, then let's end on that positive note because we're out of time. And thank you so much for the discussion, everybody. Let's keep reading and keep the conversation going. I will see you next week. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you.
Bye.
Bye.